Your cell phone.
Oh. I would miss that.
Yes. Well, what a great crowd, and thanks to everybody for sharing part of your evening with us tonight on a beautiful October day. We'd like to thank the Wheaton Historic Commission, particularly Nancy Flannery and Bob Purdy, who invited us to give this talk several months ago on the Cemeteries of Wheaton. And indeed, they collaborated with us in providing much of the information on some of the cemeteries that we're going to talk about today. Thanks to the Wheaton Public Library as well. This is a wonderful venue, and we're privileged to give presentations here. As she said, my name is Brian Ostberg, and this is Joyce, and we have the BeHistoric YouTube channel. We're actually up to 76 videos at this point, documentaries on abandoned railways, Native American archaeological sites in the area, paleontological sites in the area, mastodons and mammoths, also local history. As she mentioned, we've just done a series, finished that on the Mays Lake Peabody estate, which was a lot of work, but a lot of fun at the same time. And I did want to give a quick plug for our latest video that we just released, the Resurrectionists of St. Charles. It's sort of the opposite of tonight's topic. It's people taking bodies out of cemeteries rather than putting them into cemeteries. So you might enjoy that as well. The topic, of course, is the Cemeteries of Wheaton. This is a monumental topic. It's also a very grave topic and something that all of us are dying to get into at some point. So let's vault right into it. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so if you can hold your questions till the end, that would be great. So this presentation will discuss the cemeteries, burial sites, and memorials to the dead, I'm just checking the font, that are currently located within Wheaton proper or that have a Wheaton mailing address. And I think, as you'll realize, some of these aren't necessarily in Wheaton, but they do have a Wheaton mailing address. Just a caveat, we don't plan to address Native American burial sites, primarily because we're not aware of any within Wheaton proper. We're certainly aware of them being to the east, along the east branch of the DuPage River in Glen Ellen, and to the west in Winfield and West Chicago, along the west branch of the DuPage River. But Wheaton is riverless, and most of the burial sites are found nearby rivers, so unfortunately, we're not aware of any archaeological sites within Wheaton proper for Native Americans. So we won't be talking about that tonight, nor will we be talking about pet cemeteries. We're not aware of any pet cemeteries in Wheaton, but if there were any, we're not talking about them. But given these constraints, there's nonetheless a surprising number of burial site cemeteries and memorials within Wheaton, or the Wheaton mailing address. And our investigation accounts for at least 10 of the locations that are noted here. In this talk, we'll review the location of these sites, some of the background, origin, and history, as well as some of the notable burials in each of these locations. And although they're presented in alphabetical order here for your convenience, we're going to take them in chronological order, so from the oldest to the newest. So the question for all of you, before we get started, is, what's the oldest cemetery in Wheaton?
Wheaton.
Pleasant Hill.
Jewel Grove.
Okay, I'm hearing Jewel Grove, Pleasant Hill, Wheaton. Any other guesses?
James Burr.
James Burr. These are all good guesses. But if you said Pleasant Hill, you're probably a winner. This is based upon everything we've been able to find, all the available records that we've been able to find. And they are very close, some of these cemeteries, but based on what we've been able to find, it's very likely the oldest cemetery in Wheaton. It's located, if you're not aware, at the southeast corner of Geneva Road and Coventry Drive in northwest Wheaton. It contains 145 memorials. And strictly speaking, it's no longer an active cemetery, although there have been a few burials in the past 10 years, but this requires special permission from Milton Township. The cemetery is typically locked. It has a high fence around it. If you want to visit the cemetery, then you need to call the Milton Township office ahead of time, and they'll usually let you in. The memorials are from the mid to late 1840s. And I think, as we'll see, that ties in pretty well with the available paperwork on the cemetery. And by the way, oh yeah, the sign says 1845, so that must be what it is, right? So, a little bit about the background. As we said, we believe it to be the oldest cemetery in Wheaton, and this was started before Wheaton was a thing. I mean, I think, as most of you know, Wheaton started about 1851 with the arrival primarily of the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad, as well as the Wheatons, of course, but without the railroad, this town probably wouldn't have started at that time. It was originally referred to as the Fairview Debating Society Cemetery, a very specific name. The Fairview Debating Society was apparently a local social club or community organization, although we haven't been able to find anything more about this particular society. This was at a time when most communities had debating societies where they would discuss the hot topics of the day, or lyceums, where they would give a variety of topics that would be presented, much like the Wheaton Public Library has a forum for providing talks to the community. This is the Wheaton Public Library Lyceum. So the cemetery was had no state charter. It was started at a time prior to there being strict regulations or licensing within Illinois at that time. The cemetery's land transfer was recorded on June 13th, 1848. So that's the earliest documented evidence for it. The earliest gravestones are from 1842, although they could have been reburials or reinterments, but it's probably more likely that they weren't. So the 1845 date looks pretty good for the cemetery. The cemetery is located within Milton Township, Section 8, the northwest quarter of the northwest quarter. So this is Section 8. For those of you familiar with reading plat maps, and usually you see the jargon, they talk about quarters and halves and so on. That's how they refer to property lines, etc. So this is Section 8, which is a 1 mile square. This is the northwest quarter, and that's the northwest quarter of the northwest quarter. So you'll hear that jargon quite a bit potentially tonight. So that's where that comes from. And it first appears, so in 1851 plat map, you do not see it. Plat maps are notoriously about 3 to 5 years behind actual reality, so it's not concerning that we don't see it on this particular plat map. We do see it on the 1862 plat map where it appears for the first time. There might be earlier plat maps, but this is the earliest one that we were able to find at the DuPage County History Museum. The other interesting thing about this map in particular that I think is, look at this. This is Jewell Road. Jewell Road goes all the way into Geneva Road, straight into Geneva Road. This is back in 1851 when this was open prairie for the most part. Then, by 1862, looky, looky. There's Gary Avenue and there's Jewell Road. So it's just an interesting little thing that popped out of this map for those of you who care about such things. So this cemetery has been around for quite a long time. By the first few decades of the 20th century, the cemetery was badly neglected, and so was restored by WPA workers under the supervision of Milton Township in the mid-1930s. WPA Works Progress Administration, a program to put people back to work in the Great Depression. So that's why this program was doing this work. Before the WPA could begin work, they had to get quitclaim deeds from the descendants of the people that were buried in the cemetery before they could proceed with the work. And once they did, they restored, repaired all of the old graves. They moved some of the veterans into one corner of the cemetery. They moved the county cases into a third location within the cemetery. That section is still maintained to this day by the Milton Township. Even with this restoration, however, over time the cemetery once again fell into neglect and overgrown in the latter part of the 20th century. And about 20 years ago, as suburbia was creeping in, and there were some complaints about the cemetery was taken over by the Milton Township Cemetery Authority, who did an excellent job of restoring it, as you saw from the earlier picture, bringing it back to life, so to speak. In terms of the notable burials in the cemetery, there's 145 memorials, as we mentioned. There's multiple veterans that we'll talk about in a moment. But some of the noted burials, we have at least a few veterans from the U.S. Civil War, starting with John Ruddock, born in 1839. He was a veteran of the Civil War, a private in Company G of the 1st Missouri Engineers. The tombstone indicates that he became ill shortly after commencing his service and died shortly thereafter in Winfield. And he was buried in this cemetery in 1862 at the age of 23. Another Civil War veteran is Benjamin Stearns. He was born in 1837, also a veteran, Company C of the 12th Illinois Cavalry. He died at the age of 27 in 1864. We don't know the particulars of his death. Perhaps somebody in the audience knows, but we weren't able to find that out. The third person, Gideon Warner, is perhaps the most controversial insofar as we think he may have been a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, but there's also a real possibility that he was not. Gideon Warner, born in 1767, was indeed a veteran of the American Revolutionary War and enlisted in 1778 and served for a year as a private in Colonel Wood's regiment in New York State. But this Gideon Warner died in 1856 in Wheaton, and he was said to be in Wheaton on business. If he was in Wheaton on business in 1856, he would have been 89 years old. It's possible, but it's not probable. And some people believe that instead this is his son, Gideon Warner Jr., who is buried here instead. So this is not definitively settled as yet. We possibly could have an American Revolutionary veteran in the cemetery, but possibly not as well. All totaled, there are at least 5 veterans buried here from the potentially from the American Revolutionary War. The U.S. Civil War, like I said, there's 2. The Spanish-American War from the early 1900s and World War II. Hence, there are often military ceremonies held here on Memorial Day of every year. So, those of you who said Wheaton Cemetery, you were close. That's the next one in the mid to late 1850s. It's perhaps the most widely known cemetery in Wheaton, of course. The cemetery is located in South Wheaton at 1209 Warrenville Road. In Wheaton, about where Warrenville Road veers southwest, conveniently towards Warrenville. Familiar to anyone who's lived in the Wheaton area for any length of time. And there are more than 8,400 burials in this cemetery, which is quite a large number. And it's still quite active, I think, as everybody knows. This is the main gates, and as we'll talk about later, there's the Gary Mausoleum, which is very prominent as you enter the main gates of this cemetery. The earliest memorials are from the early 1800s, although these are almost all certainly reburials or reinterments, and you'll find out why as we go through this very quickly. Now, this cemetery is owned and managed by the Wheaton Cemetery Association, a nonprofit organization of which no member, director, or officer receives any compensation. All lots for the cemetery are sold with an agreement providing for perpetual care. In 2000, the cemetery built a columbarium, a special place for cremation burials, as many people are opting for that sort of interment these days. Now, in terms of background and history, the cemetery is located in Milton Township, Section 20, straddling the east portion of the northeast and northwest quarter, and it also extends into section 21. So let me get my bearings here. So this is section 20 here, and this is section 21, and it's right on the edge between 20 and 21. This is from 1862, and you can see the cemetery right there. Look how small that is, back in 1862. And as we'll see, this is in its very early days. The Wheaton Cemetery Association was incorporated as a nonprofit association, as we mentioned, by a special act of the Illinois legislature in February of 1857. Down at the bottom there, you can see the abstract of the legislation that provided for this Wheaton Cemetery Association. It was established by Wheaton citizens Orlando Wakely, Erastus Gary, Jesse Wheaton, Lyman DeWolf, Avery Chadwick, Peter Northrup, and Warren Wheaton. I think many of those names are familiar to those of you who are familiar with Wheaton history as being some of the early pioneers of the city of Wheaton. Jesse Wheaton donated the first acre of land for the Wheaton Cemetery, lying just outside the city limits on Warrenville Road at that time. Something else to notice on these maps, it's wonderful to look at these old maps, by the way. You could literally spend hours staring at them. Just to the northeast of the cemetery, right here, this is Warrenville Road, you see the fairgrounds, county fairgrounds. Also over here when we get over here. So for the first several decades of Wheaton's existence, the fairgrounds existed south of Roosevelt Road. And so you could, on a warm day in July, you could have a glass of freshly squeezed lemonade and stroll over to see your loved ones in the cemetery. And they would do that, by the way. They would have picnics in the cemetery often. That was not unusual. The sale of lots began shortly after this enactment in 1857, and the first internments were made shortly after that. Many local internments where people were buried in private cemeteries, private estates, or on farms, then began moving these burials into Wheaton Cemetery once it was established in 1857. And this very likely accounts for the burials from the early 1800s. More land was added from time to time, including 11 acres donated by Albert H. Gary. We'll talk about him momentarily, but he was a steel magnate, son of Erastus Gary, one of the pioneers of Wheaton, lived in Winfield Township. And like Pleasant Hill Cemetery, the Wheaton Cemetery first shows up on the 1862 plat map. By the 1897 plat map, 30 years later, you can see how much bigger it's gotten. It's grown to the north and the south. And it's continued to grow, actually, as we'll see. So these cemeteries are changing over time. They're not static by any means. So being an older cemetery and being a large cemetery, there's quite a few notable burials within Wheaton Cemetery, and we'll try to go through these quickly because there's quite a few of them. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got James Follis Jr., born in 1871. He was a professional golfer. He won the second United States Open tournament in 1896. This is when the Chicago Golf Club was one of the pioneer golf clubs in the US, and when many of the national tournaments were played at the Chicago Golf Club. A few still are, but this was back at a time when many were being played at the Chicago Golf Club. He died in 1928. The gentleman here, I think many of you would recognize that hairstyle, right? That's got to come back, right? I mean, maybe I should start doing that. He was born in 1806 in Connecticut. He arrived in DuPage County, Illinois in the early 1830s. He was one of the early founders of Wheaton, I think as many of you know. John Arthur Gammon, who's not shown here, born in 1883, born in Wheaton, a Democrat. Civil engineer, worked for railroads, worked for steel companies. He served as the U.S. Consul in various locations, then as the U.S. Consul General in London and Marseille. He died in 1967 at the age of 84. Then the next photograph on the left here is Charles William Hadley, born in 1875 in West Chicago. He was a Republican, lawyer, DuPage County State's Attorney, bank director, active in local politics, Methodist, Freemason, Knights Templar, checks all the boxes. He died in 1951, age 75. Then one of our most favorite people on this list is Charles Jones, there down in the lower corner, born in 1862 in Wales in the UK. He later spent much of his early life in Cleveland, and the reason why he's important is because he was the chief architect and engineer of the A.E.&C. Railroad. He moved here to Wheaton with his family in about 1900. The A.E.&C. Electric Railroad became the CA&E, which then became the Illinois Prairie Path. So as you're walking on the Illinois Prairie Path, you can thank that gentleman. He sadly lies in an unmarked grave in Wheaton Cemetery. His entire family, 3 children and his wife, died in advance of him. They all have markers. Horace Jane, another one of our favorites. We don't have a picture of him. Born in 1823. He lived just outside of Wheaton, to the northwest of Wheaton. He discovered the Wheaton Mastodon, not the Perry Mastodon, the Wheaton Mastodon, which was actually within Wheaton in 1869, the remains of which were tragically destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, shortly after they mounted it. He died in 1898 and is buried in Wheaton Cemetery. Captain Marcellus E. Jones, born in 1830, the gentleman with the beard towards the bottom there. He was a famous Civil War commander for the Union Army, and he passed away in 1900. Then moving up to the other side, the other tombstone, if you will, we see Margaret Landon up in the very upper right corner. Born in 1903, she was the author of Anna and the King of Siam, which became a Broadway play, The King and I, as well as a movie, etc., etc. She died in 1993, relatively recently, actually. The gentleman to the left, right here, James Howard Monroe. I think many of you, particularly who went through the school system in Wheaton, are familiar with James Howard Monroe. Born in 1944, he was a Vietnam War Medal of Honor recipient. He was killed in Vietnam, a war hero. Monroe Middle School is named for this gentleman. Jimmy Pearsall, a far-right baseball player, born in 1941. 1929. Author of the book Fear Strikes Out, which deals with mental illness while he was making his way up the ranks in Major League Baseball. He was also a Major League Baseball player as well as a baseball announcer, as a White Sox announcer for many years. He died in 2017. Did somebody say how long? Oh, I thought somebody mentioned how long he was the announcer. He was for quite a while, I remember. He was the announcer for the White Sox. The young woman here is Nina Jo. Is it Schmale or Schmale? Schmale, thank you. Want to make sure we pronounce that right. In 1941, born in 1941, she was a nursing student, and she was the unfortunate victim of mass murderer Richard Speck, who killed 8 nursing students in one night in 1966. Terrible, terrible crime. Warren Lyon Wheaton, the gentleman down in the lower right over there, born in 1812 in Connecticut, early pioneer and city founder. He arrived in the Wheaton area in the 1840s. He was a school teacher, an educator, and writer. And his younger brother, he's got that same funky beard going, Jesse. He was 1 year younger than Warren. Also from Connecticut, early pioneer and city founder, arrived in the late 1840s. He was more of a tradesman, a carpenter, a builder. And then not pictured, we have Henry Townsend Wilson, born in 1789 in Vermont, also one of the early pioneers of Wheaton. He died in 1882. And additionally, there are at least 119 veterans, probably a lot more, buried in the cemetery, but this is the only number that we have available from local databases. Now, as mentioned before, the most prominent memorial in Wheaton Cemetery was that of the Gary Mausoleum. It dominates the north part of the cemetery. It's one of the first things you see when you enter the main gates of the cemetery. The gentleman who built this was Albert H. Gary, the gentleman in the lower right there, He ordered the mausoleum to be built in 1906 to serve as the final resting place for the Gary extended family, the mausoleum housing 32 crypts. The mausoleum was constructed over a few years, starting in 1907. It was modeled after a Grecian temple, as is evident. It was constructed of granite that was mined in Vermont. The roof stones alone weighed 40 tons each. So this was a massively built structure. At the time, the memorial cost more than $100,000, which is about $2.2 million in today's money, which is an astronomical sum for a memorial. At least in my family, it would be. Albert Henry Gary, the gentleman who built this, was born in 1846 near Wheaton in Winfield Township, the son of Erastus Gary, as we mentioned, one of the city founders. He was a lawyer, a banker, DuPage County judge, the first mayor of the city of Wheaton, and the founder and president of U.S. Steel, hence the wealth. He died in Manhattan, New York in 1927 at the age of 80 years. So he is interred in that mausoleum. So now Joyce will talk about a very different site.
Oops, almost forgot to turn. Testing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you all for coming tonight, by the way. It's very nice to see such a great turnout and many familiar faces. The James Burr Burial Site is also referred to as the Chapel Hill Burial Site. It's located on the grounds of Wheaton College. It's located just north of Williston Hall and about 400 to 450 feet northeast of Blanchard Hall. In terms of the township and range, it's in Milton Township, Section 18, the southwest quarter of the northwest quarter. It's a rather unassuming memorial. Many people walk past it and never know that it's there. Many Wheaton College alumni and employees have no idea that it's there, even though they walk past it. It's just one of those things that's there and you don't see it. This is a 1905 Sanborn map of the Wheaton College campus. The blue building in the lower left is Blanchard Hall. The reddish pinkish building on the far right is Williston Hall. And the James Burr Memorial is just to the north. I'm not tall enough, it's up there. You could point it out, Brian, but I can't. You see, oh. Yeah, so it's right up in there. Where Franklin Avenue is, that's now Chase Commons. That's no longer a through street. James E. Burr was born in New York in 1814, and he attended Oberlin College in Ohio. Newspapers from the time report him as being 6 feet 4 inches tall and spare-made, so he was tall and thin. He devoted much of his life to the abolitionist movement. He lectured by day and assisted the Underground Railroad at night. It's believed that he traveled through most of the South as an agent for the Underground Railroad. He was also a friend of Dr. Jonathan Blanchard, the first president of Wheaton College. On July 12, 1841, Burr was arrested for assisting slaves to cross the Mississippi River near Palmyra, Missouri, into the Free State of Illinois. He was arrested with 2 other men, George Thompson and Alonson Work. Thompson was a fellow student with Burr at the Quincy Mission Institute, and Work was a 40-year-old husband and father. The 3 men were tried, convicted, and sentenced to 12 years of hard labor. In 1846, though, Burr and Work were pardoned, although Thompson continued to serve for several more years at the prison. Burr was likely pardoned because he had broken his wrist, so he was incapable of the hard labor. After he was released from prison, Burr returned to Quincy, Illinois. And then later he moved to Princeton, Illinois, where he was a member and trustee of the Princeton Congregational Church. It was while Burr was in Quincy that he met Jonathan Blanchard when Blanchard gave the commencement address at the Quincy Mission Institute. Blanchard also ended up moving to Princeton, Illinois, as he served at Knox College there. And while both men resided in Princeton, they continued their friendship. Burr died of tuberculosis on April 26 of 1859. Shortly before he passed away, he was visited by Blanchard. And it was thought that at this visit, Burr requested from Blanchard, well, first of all, he gave a gift to Blanchard of $500 to $600, which would be around $50,000 in today's money. It's also thought, in addition to the gift, that he asked Blanchard to see that his remains were interred at the Illinois Institute, which is now Wheaton College. Burr did not want to be buried alongside pro-slavery people, and he was afraid that due to his abolitionist views that his grave would be molested. He thought that the Illinois Institute would honor his legacy and protect his grave. So Blanchard saw that his request was fulfilled, and he was buried at Wheaton College, what is now Wheaton College. His grave was originally marked by a 7-foot-tall obelisk stone, which is in the photo on the right of the screen. During Wheaton College's early years, it was an annual custom to decorate Burr's grave. But this went out of practice after a number of years because the college was getting a lot of complaints that students were being creeped out by the burial there, especially students that were living in the dormitories close to it. In 1928, the College Board of Trustees authorized the removal and movement of the memorial and remains to nearby Wheaton Cemetery. However, alumni objected, and so this never occurred. Instead, the obelisk stone was laid on its side, and plantings were planted around the area. And in time, the obelisk was replaced by the long, flat stone that we saw earlier. Over time, the whereabouts of the obelisk kind of disappeared. Nobody really knew where it was. Then in 2012, an electrician and students who were digging in the area found it buried near the memorial site. So in 2014, the college rededicated the obelisk and installed it within the foyer of Blanchard Hall. And this left photo insert is the obelisk in its current location. The building, for anyone that's been on campus, is obviously Blanchard Hall. And the right insert is the plaque that's mounted on the memorial stone. The Jewel Grove Cemetery is a 1 to 2 acre cemetery located on the west side of Champion Forest Court and just south of Jewel Road. If you were to get there from Wheaton, you would go north on Gary, turn left or west onto Jewel Road, left again onto Champion Forest Court, which is right across the street from Carl Sandburg Elementary School. The cemetery is on the west side of Champion Forest Court, on the right side, just past the third house. There are 15 memorials in all in this cemetery, all of which are extended family members of the Cooley and Jewel family. Now, you notice that the sign says 1842, as if that is when the cemetery was established. But there's actually documentation that it probably occurred later. Originally, the Cooley and Jewel families buried their family members in the Pleasant Hill Cemetery that was located just to the north of the Jewel farm. So this is the Elias Jewel farm, and this up there is the Pleasant Hill Cemetery. But at some point, there appeared to have been a falling out between the Jewel and Cooley families and the other families who utilized the Pleasant Hill Cemetery. So the Jewel and Cooley families decided to establish their own family plot on the Elias Jewel family farm. And in March 30th of 1872, the Jewell Cemetery Association was established. And a few months later, in July of that year, those Jewell and Cooley family members who were interred at the Pleasant Hill Cemetery were moved and reburied at the Jewell Grove Cemetery. This cemetery, for those who are interested, is in Milton Township, Section 8, in the northeast quarter of the southwest quarter. Now, in confirmation of this dating, that this cemetery actually was really established probably a generation later than the 1842 on the sign, we see here it's the 1862 DuPage County plat map that we had seen when Brian was talking. And here is the Elias Jewell. He's Elias Jewell Sr., the family patriarch. The pinkish area that we've highlighted is the location of the cemetery. But you can see in 1862, it is not noted on this map. In the 1897 plat map, though, we do see the cemetery located in its current location. Proctor Price Cooley was an administrator of the cemetery, and he made provisions in his will for the care and maintenance of the cemetery. He's provided about $500, which would be about $25,000 or $30,000 in today's money. However, the executors of his will, William L. Gary and George Ruddock, his son-in-law, chose not to fulfill this request. Court cases ensued in the 1890s, and the result was that money was allocated to William Cooley for the maintenance of the cemetery. However, over time, both the Jewell and the Cooley families moved away, and by the 1960s and 1970s, suburbia had encroached upon the cemetery. The cemetery was overgrown and unkempt. Many of the memorial stones were knocked over, and the cemetery was vandalized. In the early 1900s, or 1990s, sorry, I'm getting my centuries mixed up here. In the early 1990s, there was a renewed interest in preserving and restoring this cemetery. And unfortunately, there were also the usual shall we say, discussions between the residents, preservationists, and local authorities. In the end, Milton Township Cemeteries Authority was given the authority over this cemetery, and they began the restoration of it in the early 2000s. At that time, as part of the restoration of the cemetery, they removed many of the invasive plant species, and they replaced them with plants more in keeping with the time frame of the cemetery. Now, as I mentioned, there are 15 memorials in all in the Jewell and Cooley families. These two families intermarried in the 1800s. The earliest memorials were from 1840 to the late 1850s, and so many of the earlier ones were moved from Pleasant Hill Cemetery. The latest burials were 1887 and 1908. 1908. Three notable people buried here are Elias Jewell Sr., Ira Jewell, and Proctor P. Cooley. Elias Jewell Sr. was born in 1791 and passed away in 1858. He was the first member of his family to settle in DuPage County. He arrived here after emigrating from Canada and via Connecticut and New York. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, so he's the one veteran located in this cemetery. He was married twice, initially to Harriet Howe and then later to Cynthia Whitney. Ira Jewell was born in 1818 and passed away in 1861. He was the eldest son of Elias Jewell Sr. and Harriet Howe. He was also the last postmaster at Langdon, which, if any of you had attended or watched the video on our Railroads of Wheaton talk, you might recognize that name. That was the predecessor for the Wheaton Post Office. Proctor Price Cooley was born in 1806 and passed away in 1878. His is the most elaborate headstone in the cemetery. His name may also be familiar to you if you attended or watched the video of our Winfield Mounds video series, or if you've seen the video series on our YouTube channel, as Proctor Price Cooley was the primary initial landowner in the area. And he owned the land where Winfield Mounds are located and much of the land around it. He initially married Elizabeth Irwin, who passed away in 1839. He later married Harriet Jewell, the daughter of Eliza Jewell Sr., and this is the primary connection between the Cooley and the Jewell families. The DuPage County Almshouse Cemetery is also known as the DuPage County Poor Farm Cemetery. This cemetery is located behind the DUCOM building at 420 North County Farm Road. There's a curved path that leads from the parking areas back around to the cemetery. The entrance to that gravel path is actually closest to the parking lot in front of the DuPage County Family Center at 422 North County Farm Road. This cemetery is in Winfield Township, Section 13, between the northeast and southeast quarter of the northwest quarter. It's like right on the line between Milton Township and Winfield Township. In this photograph, the building in the rear of the photograph is part of the DUCOM ETSB building complex. That's DuPage Public Safety Communications Emergency Telephone System Board. That's a mouthful. DuPage County maintains this cemetery. They care and maintain it. Couple things I want to point out. In the forefront here, we see a metal archway that reads DuPage County Farm. And next to it is a marker stone that I'll talk about in just a couple minutes. I just want you to see where they're located. The grassy area between that arch and the trees at the back is the cemetery. As you can tell from that, none of the graves are marked or identified in this cemetery. The DuPage County Almshouse was established in 1888, and it provided housing for the county's poor, disabled, elderly, and homeless. It was also called the DuPage County Poor Farm or the County Farm. It was later known as the DuPage County Convalescent Center and is today the DuPage Care Center. Initially, those people who passed away while at the DuPage County Poor Farm, they were buried in a potter's field in Wheaton Cemetery. But in 1896, the county established a cemetery at the Poor Farm, and in its current location where it is behind the DUCOM buildings. There are newspaper articles in 1896 in the Wheaton Illinoisan that describe the movement of burials from Wheaton Cemetery to the DuPage County Poor Farm Cemetery. And there were 7 burials moved at that time. What's interesting is 1897 is the first plat map that we can find that indicates the location of the Poor Farm. We've highlighted in pink here where the cemetery is, but it is not noted on this plat map or on any other plat map that we can find. So the right-hand plat map is 1935. The DuPage County Farm is obviously there in the middle, but again, there's no cemetery noted on that plat map. In 1995, or in the latter part of the 20th century, this cemetery, like many of the other small cemeteries, fell into disuse and became overgrown and unkempt again. In 1995, the county reinstalled the metal arch that we saw in the previous slide. And the following year, in 1996, they held a dedication ceremony at the cemetery, and that's when the stone was placed. An unsourced note indicates that originally there were, or at least at some point, there were 4 concrete posts located, one in each of the 4 corners of the cemetery. But those appear, at least some of them, appear to have been moved when the DuPage County Juvenile Center was enlarged. According to a 1996 Chicago Tribune article, during the restoration of this cemetery, an engineering survey found that there are probably 136 graves in that cemetery, although only 17 are documented or recorded. There are likely to be veterans here, possibly amongst the homeless. But none of those are recorded or detailed in any way. Now, this engraving on this stone says DuPage County Almshouse, established 1888, burial sites dedicated 1996. There's some controversy over the dating of this stone. You know, we've found, we're not in controversy over it, we've found controversies with it. It's possibly just the wording of it. I mean, it says the almshouse established 1888. The almshouse was established in 1888. The stone, however, is set at the cemetery. The cemetery was not established in 1888. It was 1896. So it's possible that it kind of depends on how you want to interpret the wording on this stone. So Brian will now talk about the Northside Park World War I Memorial.
Oh, that's
Nope, that's mine.
one of the cool things about this particular site too is you sort of realize, you make the connection, that's why it's called County Farm Road, because of the poor farm that was located along there. We've lived here for 25, 30 years, and we never made that connection until we were investigating this, and we realized because the poor farm ran along that road, and that's why it's called County Farm Road. Very, very cool. So the next one is a bit different. It's not a burial site per se, it's a memorial dedicated to those who died and served in World War I at Northside Park. Not died and served at Northside Park, but the memorials at Northside Park. And it's an object that many of us pass by on our way into and out of Northside Park, but often fail to take notice. I mean, we certainly are guilty of that. The obelisk is at the entrance of Northside Park, where West Street ends as it's heading north. Now, the background for this particular memorial is somewhat interesting. And we're now in the early 1920s, by the way, if you're keeping score. As part of the Memorial Day observance in May of 1922, the city of Wheaton and the American Legion erected 2 bronze plaques containing the names of 500 Wheaton residents who had served in World War I, 13 of which had died in service. The bronze plaques were set within a monument, although we have yet to find a description of that monument. We don't think it was the obelisk, but they were set within a monument, and the plaques were placed at one end of a road of remembrance as it entered into Wheaton. It's also called a memory road, and these were quite popular in the early 20s, and it was lined by more than 500 newly planted elm trees. They were planted the previous Armistice Day in 1921 by the American Legion. The memory roads were intended to honor the dead and those who served during the Great War. The monument was placed at the intersection of Naperville Road and Roosevelt Road at the northeast corner at the Warren Wheaton home, which still stands. So that was its original location. But then, in 1936, the plaques were moved to Northside Park due to the expansion of Roosevelt Road in 1930. And this is when we believe that they were set within the obelisk. The memorial was rededicated as part of Wheaton's Armistice Day observances that year in 1936, with parades, speeches, and the unveiling of the monument. More recently, the monument was rededicated on November 11th, 2017, so just 7 years ago. This rededication was related to a 2015 project that was spearheaded by the Wheaton Park District to refurbish the monument, along with it being recognized by the World War I Centennial Commission and Pritzker Military Museum Library. So you'll see another dedication plaque right by the memorial there. Now, in terms of burials associated with these plaques, as mentioned, 13 men on these plaques from Wheaton died in World War I. And those on the plaques are denoted with an asterisk or star on the plaques. And it's interesting to note that 5 of the 13 died of influenza, the influenza strain that was ravaging the world's population at that time. The poorly named Spanish flu, and I think if you know the history of the Spanish flu, you know why it's poorly named. Of the more than 116,000 US casualties in World War I, about 45,000 were due to influenza. A lot of people don't know that. That's almost 40% of the deaths, US deaths in World War I were due to influenza. It's a staggering number. The remaining 8 servicemen of the 13 died in action in France or of their wounds that they acquired in France. If you're wondering where these individuals are buried, about half are buried in France, as was the custom at that time. They did not return most of the bodies, folks that died in World War I. One is buried in England, one is buried in Hillside, Illinois, one is buried in Glen Ellen at the Forest Hill Cemetery, one's buried in Nebraska, and 4 are buried in Wheaton Cemetery. So a handful are buried in Wheaton Cemetery. So now we're up to the mid to late 1920s, and we get to St. Michael's Cemetery, which might be a bit of a surprise. St. Michael's Cemetery, located at 1109 Warrenville Road, Wheaton, Illinois, just north of and adjacent to Wheaton Cemetery. In fact, they look like one cemetery if you stand in front of them. This is a Roman Catholic cemetery, and almost 4,600 burials are within the cemetery as well. So this is quite a large number given the size of this cemetery, but it's still very much an active burial place. The cemetery, of course, is associated with St. Michael's Church, of course, which is 2/3 of a mile to the north along West Street and Illinois Avenue. The earliest memorials for the cemetery are from the 1860s, although these are likely later reburials or transfers from other cemeteries or locations, as we'll see shortly. So the history of the cemetery is intimately tied to the history of St. Michael's Roman Catholic Church. And this is perhaps the most enigmatic of the cemeteries, by the way. We do know a fair amount about the history of St. Michael's Church and its origins. The parish had its roots in St. Stephen's Mission in Gretna, a small community to the northeast of Wheaton, which was established in the early 1850s, just the same time that Wheaton was established in the early 1850s when the railroad came through. St. Michael's Catholic Church in Wheaton was established about 30 years later in 1882, and at that time a wood frame church was built for the parish. Now, over time, St. Stephen's Church faded. The community really wasn't growing. It was an agricultural community. It really wasn't growing. And then the killing blow came when they built the Chicago Great Western Railroad. And they effectively cut off the church from all road access when they put the railroad right in front of the church and the cemetery. That's why the Great Western Trail goes right in front of the cemetery. If you ever visit it, you can still visit the cemetery to this day. So as a result of that, St. Stephen's Church was closed down in 1889. And shortly after the St. Stephen's Church, I should mention too that when it did close down, most of the parishioners moved to St. John's Baptist Church in Winfield, as well as St. Michael's Church in Wheaton. So a substantial number of the early parishioners of St. Michael's came from St. Stephen's, a little bit to the northeast. St. Stephen's Church burned down shortly after it was abandoned in 1889, as often happened. And some of the wood that was salvaged was used to build a schoolhouse at St. Michael's in 1902. So they were into recycling at that time. Then, as was not uncommon in the day, as fire was a never-ending threat to these communities, fire destroyed the first St. Michael's Church in February of 1892, just 10 years after the initial construction. And a new wood frame church was quickly rebuilt, and within 5 months they had a brand new wood frame church to replace the burnt one. They built a new school in 1923, a new convent in 1938 under the leadership of Father Epstein, who was a very powerful figure within the early church in St. Michael's. And a new church was built in 1958. I think many of you in the audience are familiar with this church. It was unfortunately destroyed by fire in March of 2002 due to arson. And a beautiful new church was built in its place about 4 years later and still stands as a landmark within Wheaton today, along West Street in Illinois. Now, regarding the history of St. Michael's Cemetery, however, that's not very clear. We exchanged messages with the St. Michael's Cemetery sexton, as well as the St. Michael's parish office, and they weren't able to provide any more information about the history of the cemetery when it was originated, the original paperwork associated with the cemetery. What they could tell us was that the earliest burials were in the 1860s. So we had to dig into this further to sort of narrow this down at the very least. We dug through the newspapers, local newspapers, and the first references that we can find to St. Michael's Cemetery are in the mid-1920s. Now, this happens to coincide quite neatly with plat map information. So if we look at the 1925 plat map for Milton Township, let me get my bearings here. Right here. So this is, you see Wheaton Cemetery. This is Warrenville Road. You don't see any sign of St. Michael's Cemetery in this particular plat map. 10 years later, 1935, circa 1935, there's St. Michael's Cemetery, SM, carved out of Wheaton Cemetery. So the conclusion that we've reached so far, is that St. Michael's Cemetery had its formal origins in the mid-1920s or late 1920s under the leadership of Father Epstein again, when some sort of agreement was reached with Wheaton Cemetery to carve out a portion of the cemetery for Roman Catholic burials. And perhaps this was one of the reasons why they might have been amenable to this. As you can see, Wheaton Cemetery growing to the east in property that was formerly owned by the Wheaton family. So Wheaton Cemetery is growing. They've got room. St. Michael's approaches them about taking a portion of their cemetery for Roman Catholic burials, and some sort of agreement was likely hatched in this time frame. Now, prior to that, there may have been some sort of informal partitioning of Wheaton Cemetery from the early days. The Catholics over here, the Protestants over there, the agnostics were undecided about. But beyond that, we have not been able to find any cemetery charters or legislative acts that describe the origins of St. Michael's Cemetery, which again strongly suggests that it was carved out of an existing cemetery charter for Wheaton Cemetery. And indeed, if you look at the plat maps, it certainly looks like it was carved out of Wheaton Cemetery. In terms of notable burials, there are several. We'll cover a few of these here. The first on the leftmost is another tragic story, Helen and Margaret Bolweg, two sisters, 118, 121. They both died on the same day in 1928. They worked at the DuPage County Abstract Office near the county building in Wheaton, and were on their way home from work on October 1st. In 1928, driving in the rain, when their car that they were driving, the older sister was driving the car, was struck broadsided by a C&E train at the Montview station right at Winfield Road. So if you know where the Prairie Path crosses by St. James Farm, just to the south of St. James Farm, that's where the Montview station was. And so their car was broadsided. One of the young women was thrown from the car, killed immediately. The other was trapped in the car, and sparks from the electric train lit the gasoline on fire, and the poor woman was incinerated. It was a terrible accident. but they're buried in the adjoining graves in the St. Michael Cemetery. Elmer Joseph Hoffman, born 1899 near Wheaton, served in the U.S. Army. He's the gentleman in the middle there, by the way. He served in the U.S. Army during World War I. He was a Republican, Illinois State Treasurer, U.S. Representative from the Illinois 14th District. He died in Wheaton in 1976. And then finally, Helen Munsert, the woman on the far right there. She was born in 1910, a graduate of the University of Chicago, valedictorian of her class at Chicago Kent College of Law in 1935. She was an attorney with the Interstate Commerce Commission, then became the assistant commissioner for the Illinois ICC, then the ICC's public hearing examiner. And at that time, she was being considered for federal judge positions on the Illinois Circuit Courts. And this is quite an accomplishment at a time when a professional woman had a much, much harder time making progress with their career. She also held many important positions with the Chicago Bar Association and other professional organizations. And for us, she inspired the CA&E Trolley Christmas Story, based on true events that occurred in 1947, which we won't go into detail about tonight, but it's a very happy, positive story if you ever hear about it. She sadly, again, lies in an unmarked grave. Her husband, who was also a physician and an attorney, had preceded her in death by a few years. He has a marker. They didn't have any family in the area. They lived by Wheaton-Warrenville High School along Warrenville Road. They had a 5-acre farm, the two of them. So she died. She was placed in an unmarked grave. The St. Michael Cemetery includes burials for at least 121 U.S. veterans. Now, the next site, now we're getting into the mid-1950s. This is the Cantini Estate burials. The site consists of 2 burials located on the Cantini Estate, located at 1 South 151 Winfield Road in Wheaton. The burial site is about 250 feet southeast of the McCormick Mansion, which you can see from Roosevelt Road, set within a formal grove of trees. McCormick erected this final resting place for he and his first wife in the form of a Greek exedra, as they were called, a public sitting place often set aside public buildings or temples. The exedra was the place where people would sit, have conversations. News of the day was passed from ear to ear. And McCormick saw it as something of the first newspapers. And McCormick was, of course, a newspaper man, as we'll talk about momentarily. So he thought this was a suitable monument for him. The 2 flat headstones that you can see, guarded by canines, they both were dog lovers, so hence they have their guardians for eternity. The memorial was designed by Andrew N. Rabori, who worked with Robert McCormick shortly before his death to create this design. The material to build the exedra and the entire monument, again, was granite mined from North Carolina. And the crypts of the 2 of Robert McCormick and his wife Amy are set underground with an poured concrete foundation. It's a massive foundation because it has to bear the weight of this granite that sits on top of it, which is 420 tons. Now, just going through these 2 individuals very quickly, that's Robert Rutherford McCormick to the left. He was a veteran of World War I. Served as a battalion commander, lieutenant colonel, colonel of the field artillery in the 1st Battalion of the U.S. Army. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal from General Pershing in 1923. But I think, as most people in this room know, McCormick's fame and fortune was made as a journalist and a newspaper publisher of the Chicago Tribune. He was elected president of the Tribune in 1911. Then enlisted in the years that followed in the Illinois National Guard, which was then part of the U.S. Army, where he fought in France. After the war, he continued to operate the Tribune as well as multiple other newspapers, a radio station, a TV station, multiple paper mills, so he had quite an empire. After his first wife, Amy, the woman to the right, died in 1939, he married a woman by the name of Maryland Matheson in 1944. He also started the Joseph Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, a very famous school of journalism. I'm sure most of you know that, named after his maternal grandfather. And when he died, he left his fortune to the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, a charitable organization focused on early childhood education, journalism, veterans, and supporting various Chicago communities. The other burial is of his first wife, Amy DeHool Irwin, born in 1872. She was an artist and noted art patron, and she accompanied her husband to France during World War I, probably to keep an eye on him. Her early death was as a result of cancer, although the primary cause was listed as pneumonia. And in case you're wondering, the second wife, Maryland, was later buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, very famous cemetery in Chicago, when she died in 1985. She was buried along with other McCormicks in the Medill family plot. That's again on his mother's side. One has to wonder how she felt about the massive tomb erected for McCormick and his first wife with a design that did not include her. He just wanted to be a fly on the wall when he announced that to her. Now we're into the late 1950s, early 1960s, and Assumption Cemetery comes to the fore. Assumption Cemetery is located at 1 South 510 Winfield Road in Wheaton, Illinois. There are currently more than 8,400 burials in this cemetery, putting it on par with the Wheaton Cemetery to the northeast, but the cemetery is 90 years younger, so it's growing at a much faster rate. This is another Roman Catholic cemetery, and it's still very much active in a manner of speaking. The first internment at Assumption Catholic Cemetery was on December 13th, 1962. And just in corroboration of that, local newspapers start to refer to the cemetery in 1963. A chapel was added in 1971. In terms of background, it's located in Winfield Township along Winfield Road, Section 23 taking up much of the southeast quarter. This is Section 23, much of the southeast quarter of Section 23 is taken up by Assumption Cemetery. The origins are in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and this coincides roughly with the establishment of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Joliet, which was formed in 1949. So within a few years after forming the diocese, they started acquiring some land. And the reason why they were doing this is to serve the various Roman Catholic communities in western DuPage County. As you can see from the plat map, so this is Winfield Road, thank you. This is Winfield Road right here, off which the cemetery is located. This was all farmland, primarily owned by George Yeager, E.J. Davidson, and A.M. Cornell to the north. And so there was nothing but agricultural land here prior to the 1955 timeframe. One of the reason why the 1993 map is included here is that this is the first map that we could find from the U.S. Geological Survey that shows Assumption Cemetery on the map. There are earlier USGS maps from the 1970s that show the initial formation of the cemetery, but it doesn't really make it on the map until 1993, which is rather curious. There's probably a reason for that, but we don't know what it is. So, 8,400 burials. There are some notable burials here, but this is a newer cemetery, so there's not as many notable interments as at Wheaton Cemetery, for instance. And although the first internments were in the 1960s, some of the memorials date back to the mid-1930s, and those were reinterments that were moved into Assumption Cemetery after the cemetery was established. Some of the notable burials include, I think many of you recognize the gentleman on the left, Henry John Hyde, born 1924, died in 2007, U.S. Congressman for the Republican Party. Then we have, Walter Moose Moran, born 1926 in St. Paul, Minnesota, American Major League Baseball outfielder. Moran played in the majors from 1954 to 1961 for 4 major league teams, including the Cubs, Pittsburgh Pirates, St. Louis Cardinals, and Brooklyn Dodgers. He died in Winfield in 1996 at the age of 70. In addition, there are buried here at least 233 U.S. veterans. Again, likely more, but that's all that shows up in the local databases. We finally get to the final place of internment within Wheaton. This is the newest place of internment, and it's in the very heart of Wheaton, no less, only a short distance from Main Street. It's the Trinity Episcopal Church Columbarium. I think, as we mentioned, a columbarium is a collection of niches that hold the ashes of the deceased in cremation burials. The Trinity Episcopal Church and Columbarium are located at 130 North West Street, Wheaton, the southwest corner of West and Wesley. I think many of you might pass by this structure on a weekly or even daily basis. The columbarium itself is located in an outdoor garden of the church. We'll get a picture of that in a moment. And it's still very much an active church. The history of that was that it was established in Wheaton in the year 1875. The original church, the brown church on the corner there, was built in 1881, a Prairie Gothic revival style, and is the oldest church building in Wheaton in continuous use, now being more than 140 years old. A new church, you can see of brick, was built in 1958, augmenting the original church. The original church in the Prairie Gothic style was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. So the columbarium itself, these are a few pictures of it, is an outside garden of the church, was established in the early to mid 1970s and has been in continuous use since that time. There are currently 146 memorials as well as internments within the columbarium at present. And we were told by the church office that the columbarium is open to non-church members, although they would need to discuss this, the particulars ahead with the church elders, of course. So that ends our formal presentation on this topic. We hope that you enjoyed this little tour of the Wheaton cemeteries and burial sites. Hopefully it gave you some useful information or things to consider as you're walking or driving by many of these places. For more information, we'd suggest you visit one or more of these sites. They're very interesting in their own right. Also, the DuPage County Museum, their archives or their research room you can visit. The Wheaton Public Library has a great local history section and genealogy section, which will also provide you with a lot of information. Both of these latter places, by the way, have a lot of old maps, and you'll learn a lot by studying these old maps. So bring your camera or your cell phone and take pictures, because you'll want to ponder them after you leave. So I think we have time for Q&A.
A few questions if I can get the mic. Thank you so much. So we will take just a couple of minutes for questions here. If you have a question, if you raise your hand, I'd be happy to bring the mic to you. Got one up here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. In your research, did you come across any rumor that the Mary Pogue Sanitarium, which was located, are you familiar with Mary Pogue Sanitarium?
Is that in Winfield or?
No, it was in Wheaton on the corner of Geneva Road and Main Street.
No.
Across from Jewel.
Yes, yeah, it was on both sides. The office was on the southwest corner, and on the southeast corner was the, so what it was started in the 30s and the 40s and ran into the 50s. It was a lady that had a school for handicapped children. And there's rumors, but it's never been confirmed, that they had their own little cemeteries there.
Interesting. No, we did not come across that in our research. So the gentleman was just saying that, if you couldn't hear him, that there was a sanatorium, a tuberculosis sanatorium
He said handicapped children.
Oh, handicapped children, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like a school.
Now there was a place for handicapped children by Prince Crossing Station, that is definite. And Wheaton Academy took over those buildings. So we're very familiar with that one.
Okay.
That's Dr. Isaac Prince ran that, hence Prince Crossing. But we're not familiar with that one.
Yeah, Mary E. Pogue.
Mary E. Pogue.
UE. Yeah.
Pogue.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we'll look that up, thank you. Yeah, we'll have to look that up and see if we can find out more information about that. Yes?
Thank you. Yes, I'm fascinated with E.H. Gary because there's so little that was written about him. There's no biography or anything like that. But that is one substantial mausoleum.
It sure is.
And it does, in a way, because the caryatids that are on the west side mimic the Museum of Science and Industry. Is there any documentation on the architect of that mausoleum?
Very good question. So the question is there any information about the architect or design or architecture of that particular museum? All we could find was in newspapers. We could find the design. The one picture that we showed in the upper right-hand corner was from a newspaper in 1906, which was showing the design. So it was already architected by that point in time. But we didn't find any information on the particulars of that. That would be very, very interesting indeed.
My question was regarding Wheaton College specifically. I know that it's known to be one of the few documented places in Illinois, northern Illinois, where there was a railroad, underground railroad that went through. And you mentioned, I think his name was James Burke. What?
Yeah.
Do you think he had some sort of connection that he chose to be buried there? I just wondered about that.
Do you want to answer that or do you want me to?
Well, I'm sorry. At the time when he passed away, it was still the Illinois Institute, and yes, it was, Blanchard was supposed to be, slaves are supposed to have been hidden in Blanchard, and Jonathan Blanchard was supposed to be a very big abolitionist. I think probably he requested to be buried there because it probably was a site on the Underground Railroad, and that's why he thought his grave would be protected there. I don't know that I don't know how much he actually would have been up there. He may have been, if he traveled all over the South, he may have traveled up here too. We didn't find anything about that though, so sorry.
The farm is also kind of part of that movement too, so I didn't know that farm over in
Yeah, I'm not sure about that.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the second part.
Oh, I had mentioned Peck Farm over in, that's Lombard.
Okay.
Another well-known site for the underground
Okay.
railroad.
Other questions, comments?
There's one over here, so I'm just going to.
Okay. You have to work pretty hard, Barry.
Yes, where can one go to find those plat maps? 'Cause I believe my house is located on the old county farm, or county, the county fair grounds, which explains some of the lush grass I have.
Right, exactly. So if you go to the DuPage County History Museum, which was the old Adams Library, and on the second floor, the research room, there's a corner that has a large number of maps, including plat maps. They're open and accessible to anybody who wants to look at them. You don't have to have any special permission. You do need to tell them that you're looking at them when you come into the front desk. But yeah, you can look at several different plat maps going back from 1851 through 1959, I believe. So there's quite a bit of information there. The caveat about the plat maps is they tend to be, again, 3 to 5 years behind reality. So when you're looking at them, you have to sort of take that into account. But
Are they pretty accurate? Can one overlay a newer one on top of the old one?
you can, but they weren't drawn to scale. They weren't drawn for that purpose. That archaic language that we hear of, the southwest quarter, of the northwest quarter, of lot one, that was the legal description of property even today. The plat maps were more of an indication of about where the property lines were, but you certainly couldn't use them to, this is the exact line or the exact place. You can indeed put them on top of one another and learn a lot by doing that. We've done that, in fact.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more questions here.
I'll just make a quick comment. It's sort of interesting about the Jewel Grove Cemetery, that Wheaton College's first commencement, not Illinois Institute, but as Wheaton College, was held there. The students and city fathers, they all walked out to Jewel Grove and had the ceremony. So,
What year was that?
that would have been, 1860, I believe.
Okay.
Either 1860 or 61, because the school, it became Wheaton College in 1860. So I'm assuming it was that year or maybe the next year.
Yeah, that was a whole interesting dynamic when, as Joyce mentioned, there was, I guess they were the debating society, so it fits that they debated and somebody took their ball and went home, took their graves and moved them elsewhere. So,
What year did Jewel Road dead end at Gary?
well, sometime between 1851 and 1862. We know that based on the plat maps. We don't know exactly, but in that interval, 1855-ish time frame.
And it dead ended at St. Charles?
Originally, it went to Geneva, went straight through.
Up by the driving park?
I'd have to look at the map to figure out how close it got to Northside Park and the driving park, but it went through at a diagonal straight through, and then as you saw on the 1862 map, all of a sudden it stops at Gary Avenue, perhaps because the landowner didn't want people going through there anymore, I don't know. But yeah, it's fascinating again to look at these old maps and you pick out these little things like that and you go, wow, look at that. Didn't realize that. So
Yeah, but in 1850, a road would be different than a road today.
yeah, it would be a dirt,
Path.
yeah, exactly.
All right, well, thank you so very much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight.
And just a reminder, we did have the privilege of recording this program, so you'll actually receive